The screams echoed through the crystalline halls of Station Cormouth, and nobody moved to help. Dr. James Walker stood outside the ritual chamber, his medical scanner clutched uselessly in his hand. The device beeped softly, displaying readings that made his stomach turn. Through the transparent wall, he could see her, the massive albino dragon called Velora, her scales white as fresh snow, her body convulsing in agony. Each spasm sent ripples across her enormous form, and every time she moved, another cry of pain tore from her throat. James had been on this station for 8 months now, the only human doctor among dozens of alien species. He'd seen many things that disturbed him, many customs that made no sense to his earthborn mind. But this was different. This was a patient in pain, and every instinct in his body screamed at him to help. "You cannot enter, human." The guard, a towering reptilian named Dravik, blocked his path with a clawed arm. His scales were dark green, almost black, and his eyes held the cold certainty of someone who had never questioned his beliefs. The Elder Mother must complete her sacred return to the void. James watched as another spasm racked Velora's body. Her massive wings twitched, scraping against the polished floor. Her son, a young warrior named Kale, knelt beside her with tears streaming down his scaled face. The boy, though he was probably 50 years old by human standards, looked utterly helpless. He held his mother's claw in both hands, whispering words James couldn't hear through the thick glass. The disease was called crystal spine. James had read about it in the station's medical database when he first arrived. The victim's own bones began to transform, turning from living tissue into jagged mineral shards that grew outward, piercing through muscle and organ tissue from the inside. It was slow. It was painful. And according to every Drakthar medical text, it was incurable. But James knew better. "That's not a sacred return," James said quietly, his eyes still fixed on Velora's suffering form. "That's torture. It is our way." Dravik's voice held no room for argument. His tone was flat, mechanical, as if he'd said these words 1,000 times before. "For 10,000 years the elders have died with honor. She chose this chamber. She accepted her fate. It is the way of our people since before your species learned to walk upright." James felt anger rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. Getting emotional wouldn't help anyone. He looked at his scanner readings one more time, his trained eyes analyzing the data. The crystallization pattern was aggressive, spreading faster than the medical text suggested it should. But it was treatable. He'd seen similar conditions in deep-pressure environments back on Earth, in divers who'd spent too long at extreme depths. The procedure would be risky, yes, and invasive. It would require precision surgery, equipment he'd have to modify, and hours of delicate work. And it would require breaking every rule the Drakthar held sacred. "I could," James started. "Blasphemy." Dravik said the word before James could even finish his sentence. The guard's eyes narrowed and his claws flexed menacingly. "You would rob her of her honored death. You would shame her bloodline for eternity. The Elder Mother has earned her place in the void. She has lived with dignity. She will die with dignity. This is not your concern, human." Inside the chamber, Velora's screams grew weaker. Not because the pain was lessening, James could see from his scanner that the crystallization was accelerating, but because she was losing the strength to scream. Her breathing came in shallow gasps now. Her son pressed his forehead against her scales, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James looked around the corridor. Other aliens walked past, going about their daily business. Some glanced at the chamber with what might have been sympathy, but none stopped. None questioned. This was normal to them. Expected. Sacred even. A Zentari merchant hurried past, its tentacles full of data pads. A cloth engineer stood nearby, adjusting a wall panel, deliberately not looking at the chamber. 2 Vizari diplomats conversed in low tones at the far end of the corridor, their translated words discussing trade routes and shipping schedules as if a living being wasn't dying in agony just meters away. James felt something cold settle in his gut. Not fear. Not exactly. It was the same feeling he'd had back on Earth during his residency, when he'd watched a patient die because hospital administration had denied a procedure due to cost. The same feeling when bureaucracy and tradition and the way things are done took precedence over a life that could be saved. He'd sworn an oath. Not to a culture, not to a tradition, but to every living being who needed his help. Dravik watched him carefully, reading the expression on the human's face. "Do not do something foolish, Dr. Walker. Respect our ways. This is not your world. These are not your people." James turned and walked away, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists. His footsteps echoed on the crystal floor, each step measured and deliberate. Dravik watched him go, satisfied that the human had finally accepted reality. The guard returned to his post, standing at attention beside the chamber door. But James didn't go far. He walked just around the corner out of Dravik's line of sight and stopped. He leaned against the wall, his mind already racing through possibilities. Equipment he would need. Access codes. Timing. Risk assessment. His scanner was still in his hand, still displaying Velora's vital signs. Still showing him a patient who didn't have to die. James looked down at the device, then back toward the chamber he'd just left. On Earth, there was a phrase that every doctor learned, usually from older physicians who'd seen too much death: "Not on my watch." It meant that as long as you were there, as long as you had the skills and the tools and even the smallest chance of success, you fought. You didn't accept the inevitable. You didn't bow to tradition or fear or the weight of 10,000 years of, "This is how we've always done it." You fought. James pushed off the wall and headed toward his medical bay. He had work to do and not much time to do it. Behind him, Velora's screams had stopped entirely. That terrified him more than anything else. 3 hours later, James was in his medical bay, going through his equipment for the third time. His hands moved on autopilot, cleaning instruments he'd already cleaned twice, checking supplies he'd already inventoried. He couldn't stop thinking about Velora's face twisted in pain. Couldn't stop hearing those screams that had finally gone silent. The door to his bay slid open with a soft hiss. Kale stood in the doorway and James almost didn't recognize him. The young dragon warrior looked exhausted, his scales dull with grief instead of their usual vibrant shimmer. His eyes were red and there were fresh tear tracks down his face. He glanced over his shoulder nervously before stepping inside, letting the door close behind him. "She's still conscious," Kale whispered, his voice barely audible. James had to lean forward to hear him. "The priests say it's a blessing. That her suffering purifies her spirit. That every moment of pain burns away her worldly attachments and prepares her for the void." James felt his jaw clench. He'd heard similar things from the priests earlier, their voices calm and serene as they discussed a dying woman like she was some kind of spiritual exercise. Kale's voice cracked. "But I heard her human. When no one else was listening, when the priests had left and the guards changed shifts, she whispered to me. She begged me." He stopped, his whole body trembling. "She doesn't want to die." James set down the surgical instrument he'd been cleaning. It clinked against the metal tray, the sound loud in the quiet room. "What are you saying?" Kale moved closer, his footsteps heavy despite his obvious attempt at stealth. "I'm saying my mother is in agony, and your species has a reputation." His eyes locked onto James's and there was something desperate and wild in them. Something that reminded James of family members back on Earth, the ones who waited in hospital corridors, clinging to any shred of hope. Everyone in the galaxy knows this about humans. You don't accept death. You fight it. You rage against it. When every other species says something is impossible, humans find a way. James felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. It was true in a way. Humanity had a stubborn streak that other species found either admirable or insane, depending on who you asked. Humans had dragged themselves out of caves and conquered their own planet through sheer refusal to accept limitations. They'd gone to space when it should have killed them. They'd colonized hostile worlds through nothing but determination and duct tape. But this was different. This wasn't about human stubbornness. This was about breaking laws that had stood for 10,000 years. "Your people would never forgive you," James said carefully, watching Kale's face. "You'd be cast out, labeled a heretic. Stripped of your rank, your title, everything you've worked for. Your friends would turn away from you. The temples would bar your entry. You understand that, right? You understand what you're asking me to help you do?" "My mother raised me alone after my father died in battle," Kale interrupted, his voice stronger now. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been holding them back for too long. "The other warriors looked down on us. A widow and her son, without a strong male to lead the family. She could have remarried. The priests encouraged it. But she refused. She raised me by herself, taught me to hunt, to fight, to think." He stepped even closer, and James could see the crystalline structure of his scales, could smell the faint mineral scent that all Drakthar carried. "She taught me that honor wasn't about following rules blindly," Kale continued. "She said real honor meant protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Standing up for what was right even when everyone else said you were wrong. She's the strongest being I've ever known, human. The strongest, the wisest, the bravest. And now she can't even speak her own truth. She has to whisper her fear to me in the dark because admitting she wants to live would shame her in the eyes of our people. Kale's claws dug into his palms, drawing thin lines of blue blood. Can you save her? James turned to his computer console and pulled up the scans he'd taken earlier. The three-dimensional image of Valora's skeletal structure rotated slowly in the air between them. The crystallization showed up as bright white against the darker bone structure, spreading like frost across a window. The crystallization is spreading through her neural spine, James said, pointing to the affected areas. See these branches here? They're growing into her spinal column, wrapping around the nerves that control everything from her wings to her heart. I'd need to operate directly on her spinal column, cutting away the crystals without damaging the nerves themselves. He zoomed in on a particularly dense cluster. The equipment I have here isn't designed for someone her size. Your people are, 20 times larger than humans? 30? My surgical tools are made for beings my size. It would be like trying to perform brain surgery with garden tools. Kale's face fell, but James kept talking. The procedure would take hours. Maybe 4, maybe 6, I won't know until I'm in there. My hands would cramp. My eyes would strain. One mistake, one slip of the blade and I could paralyze her or worse. And if we're caught? There's a 4-hour window tonight, Kale said quickly. The priests perform the blessing of silence at midnight. It's a ritual where they seal the chamber and pray in the temple. No one enters the death chamber during that time. It would break every sacred law, but we'd have time. 4 hours of complete privacy. James studied the young warrior's face. He saw desperation there, yes, but also something else. Determination. The same kind of fierce, stubborn determination that James had seen in mirrors back on Earth, usually right before he did something incredibly stupid and possibly brilliant. He thought about the Hippocratic Oath he'd taken back on Earth, standing in an auditorium full of other medical students, all of them young and idealistic and certain they would change the world. First, do no harm. That's what everyone remembered. But there was more to it. The promise to preserve life. To use his skills for the benefit of his patients. To remember that there was art to medicine as well as science, and that warmth, sympathy, and understanding could sometimes matter as much as any drug. Nowhere in that oath had it said, only for humans. He thought about every impossible case he'd been told to abandon. The patient with the rare disease that had no cure, until James had tried an experimental treatment anyway. The accident victim everyone said wouldn't walk again, who'd walked out of the hospital 6 months later. The child with the failing heart, who was now a teenager playing sports. He thought about Valora's screams, echoing through those crystal halls, ignored by everyone except the son who loved her. The station's ventilation system hadn't been designed with humans in mind. The shaft was narrow, barely wide enough for James to squeeze through on his belly. Metal edges scraped against his shoulders as he crawled forward, dragging a heavy bag of medical equipment behind him. The air inside was hot and stale, smelling of recycled oxygen and machine oil. His arms burned from pulling himself along inch by painful inch. Below him, through the grated floor of the shaft, he could see Kale working at a maintenance terminal. The young warrior's claws moved quickly across the holographic interface, overriding security protocols one by one. Green lights turned red, then dark. Camera feeds looped. Alarm systems went silent. James had always been small for his species, something that had bothered him as a teenager back on Earth. Now, squeezed into this alien ventilation system, he was grateful for every inch he'd never grown. A larger man wouldn't have made it past the first junction. His watch display glowed in the darkness. They had 3 hours and 42 minutes. Not long. Not nearly long enough for what he was about to attempt. The shaft ended at a grate above the death chamber. Kale appeared below, reaching up to help James down. Together, they lowered the equipment bag carefully, trying not to make noise. Every small sound seemed to echo through the chamber. Inside the death chamber, Valora lay motionless on the raised platform. James approached her slowly, his medical scanner already out and beeping softly. Her breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. Her albino scales, which had been pure white that morning, had taken on a sickly gray tinge where the crystals pushed against her skin from within. He could see the outlines of the crystal formations, like jagged shadows beneath her scales. James unpacked his equipment with practiced efficiency. A portable surgical laser, smaller than his forearm but powerful enough to cut through bone. A bone knitter that hummed when he activated it. Harmonic resonators originally designed for breaking up kidney stones in human patients. A scanner that immediately started beeping angry warnings about operating outside its specified parameters, displaying error messages in 3 languages. He ignored the warnings and set up his makeshift operating theater. Across the station, in the shadows of maintenance corridors and private quarters, Other species watched through Kale's hacked security feed. Word had spread quickly through the station's underground network. The human was actually going to try it. A Zentari trader named Vorn sat hunched over a data pad in his quarters, his tentacles curled in anticipation. He nudged his companion, a younger Zentari who worked in cargo processing. The human's actually going to try it? Look at him setting up. He's insane, his companion breathed. Does he not understand what the Drakthar will do to him if he's caught? In another section of the station, a cloth engineer watched the feed on a wall-mounted screen, his forearms crossed. Impossible, he muttered to himself. The Drakthar have declared it medically unfeasible for centuries. Their best doctors couldn't stop Crystal Spine. What makes this human think he can? A Vizari diplomat stood in her office, the security feed projected in the air before her. Her species was known for their careful observation of other cultures, their patient study of what made different beings tick. She watched James work with calculating eyes. Humans don't know what impossible means, she observed quietly to her aide. That's what makes them dangerous. And fascinating. Back in the chamber, James made the first incision. The surgical laser cut through Velora's scales with precision, but even this first step was challenging. Her scales were thicker than any textbook had suggested, and the laser had to be recalibrated twice before it cut cleanly. The surgery was brutal from the start. Every tool James had was too small, designed for human-sized patients or at most for the smaller alien species. It was like trying to repair a spacecraft engine with tools meant for a wristwatch. Every technique had to be adapted on the fly, modified, improvised. Velora's biology didn't match anything in his medical database. Her circulatory system ran in patterns he'd never seen. Her nerves bundled differently. Her muscle structure was alien in the most literal sense. He worked by instinct, by comparison to similar cases, by sheer stubborn refusal to accept failure. When one approach didn't work, he tried another. When a tool proved inadequate, he modified it or grabbed a different one. 2 hours in, his hands were steady despite the exhaustion creeping through his body. His back screamed from bending over at an awkward angle. His eyes burned from staring through the magnification lens. But his hands didn't shake. Years of surgical training had taught him that much. You could be tired, hungry, scared, but your hands had to stay steady. Kale held lights where James needed them, passed instruments before James even asked, and watched the human work with growing awe. He'd seen Drakthar surgeons work before, seen their confident movements and their advanced tools. This was different. This was desperate and improvised and shouldn't be working. But it was working. James removed crystal fragments one by one, each extraction requiring microscopic precision to avoid severing the neural pathways that ran like cables through Velora's spine. The crystals were sharp, catching light like diamonds, beautiful and deadly. Some were small as grains of sand. Others were larger, branching structures that had wrapped around nerves and blood vessels. Sweat dripped down his face, falling onto his surgical mask. His arms ached. His fingers cramped. But he kept working, kept cutting, kept extracting each crystalline shard with the care of a jeweler removing precious stones. The pile of removed crystals grew on the instrument tray beside him, glittering in the harsh surgical lights. Velora's breathing grew stronger, deeper, more regular. The gray tinge began to fade from her scales, color slowly returning. 30 minutes left, Kale whispered urgently, his eyes on the chronometer. The priests will finish their prayers soon. James nodded, not looking up from his work. His world had narrowed to the surgical field in front of him, to the next crystal that needed removing, to the next nerve that needed preserving. In his mind, he could hear his old professor's voice from medical school, the grizzled surgeon who'd trained him during his residency. Sometimes the patient doesn't need you to be perfect, Walker. They just need you to refuse to quit. Medicine isn't about being the smartest or having the best equipment. It's about being too stubborn to let death win. James had carried those words with him through every difficult surgery, every case where the odds were stacked against him. He'd never quit before. He wasn't starting now. His hands moved with renewed focus, extracting crystals, sealing blood vessels, repairing damaged tissue. The portable scanner beeped steadily beside him, showing Velora's vital signs growing stronger with each passing minute. Outside, the priests continued their prayers, unaware that everything they believed about death and honor was being challenged in the chamber below. With 15 minutes remaining, James hit the complication he'd been dreading. His scanner beeped 3 times in rapid succession, a warning tone he'd learned to hate during his years as a surgeon. He pulled back from the incision and stared at the holographic display hovering beside him. The largest crystal cluster had fused directly with Velora's primary neural cortex, the center of her memories, her personality, everything that made her who she was. The crystallization had wrapped around it like a cage, or more accurately, like roots strangling the trunk of a tree. "Can you remove it?" Cale asked, his voice tight with fear. He'd been watching the scanner too, and even without medical training he could see that something was wrong. James studied the scan, zooming in and rotating the image. His heart sank as he traced the crystal formations with his finger. They weren't just touching the neural cortex. They'd grown into it, threading through the delicate brain tissue like invasive vines. "If I remove it, she loses everything," he said quietly. "Every memory of you, of her life, of who she is. She'd wake up, maybe, but she'd be empty. A blank slate. Not your mother anymore, just a body with no past." He looked at the chronometer on the wall. The glowing numbers seemed to mock him. "If I leave it, she has maybe 10 minutes before it severs her brainstem. Then none of this matters." Cale's claws clenched, drawing more of his own blood. The blue drops fell to the floor, but he didn't seem to notice. "Then she dies either way. We came this far for nothing." "Maybe not either way." James sat back on his heels, closing his eyes. His mind raced through everything he knew. The crystal structure. Mineral formations. Growth patterns. There had been a lecture back on Earth years ago that he'd almost skipped because it seemed too theoretical. Dr. Patterson, an elderly physician who'd worked in acoustic medicine, talking about harmonic frequencies and how sound waves could affect solid matter at the molecular level. The old doctor had shown videos of kidney stones being shattered by focused sound, of bone fractures being encouraged to heal faster through specific vibrations. He'd even demonstrated how certain frequencies could cause crystal formations to reorganize their molecular structure without breaking them apart. At the time, James had thought it was interesting but not particularly useful. Now, in an alien death chamber with minutes to spare, that half-remembered lecture might be the only thing standing between Valora and death. "Hold the scanner steady," James said suddenly, grabbing the harmonic resonator from his equipment bag. His hands moved with purpose now, the exhaustion forgotten in the rush of possibility. "Try what?" Cale asked, positioning the scanner where James pointed. "Something your people never considered." James adjusted the resonator's frequency, watching the readout carefully. "Your doctors saw the crystals as the enemy. Something to remove, to fight against. But what if we don't remove them? What if we work with them instead?" Cale stared at him. "I don't understand." "Crystals are just organized molecules," James explained, his fingers flying over the controls. "They form patterns based on environmental conditions. Temperature, pressure, vibration. What if we change those conditions? What if we realign them into a pattern that doesn't kill her?" He triggered the device. The harmonic resonator hummed to life, emitting a sound too low for human ears to properly hear but felt as a vibration in the chest. The crystals in Valora's neural cortex began to vibrate in response, their molecular structure shifting under the harmonic waves. James watched the scanner display with intense focus, adjusting the frequency in real time. Too high and the crystals would shatter, sending fragments deeper into her brain. Too low and nothing would happen. He needed the exact frequency that would cause reorganization without destruction. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His finger hovered over the adjustment control, making micro-corrections every few seconds. He was guiding the crystallization away from the neural pathways, encouraging it to form new patterns, a lattice that integrated with her nervous system instead of destroying it. It was insane. No medical textbook had ever suggested such a procedure. He was essentially turning a deadly disease into a permanent part of her biology, gambling that he could control how it formed. It was unprecedented. It worked. The crystals stabilized, forming a shimmering network through her neural cortex. On the scanner, James watched as the threatening formations reorganized themselves into delicate, branching patterns that followed the natural pathways of her nervous system. Instead of crushing the nerves, the crystals now traced alongside them, like decorative filigree on a piece of architecture. Valora's vital signs strengthened. Her heart rate steadied, growing stronger and more regular. Her brain activity, which had been erratic and fading, suddenly surged with healthy patterns. The gray tinge faded from her scales, replaced by something new, faint crystalline patterns that pulsed with soft bioluminescence. They spread across her body like glowing tattoos, following the lines of her musculature and bone structure. Blue light rippled beneath her white scales in waves, synchronized with her heartbeat. James sealed the incision with trembling hands, his bone knitter closing the surgical site with practiced efficiency. He finished 30 seconds before the sound of footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. The priests were returning early. Kale stared at his mother in wonder, his eyes wide. What did you do? She's glowing. I've never seen anything like this. I have no idea, James admitted, frantically packing his equipment back into the bag. His hands shook now, adrenaline and exhaustion catching up with him. But she's stable. Her vitals are strong. The crystals are integrated instead of invasive. Now get me out of here before. The chamber doors opened with a ceremonial hiss. 5 priests entered, their robes flowing behind them as they chanted the ritual prayers that marked the end of the blessing of silence. Their voices were deep and resonant, filling the chamber with sacred words. They froze mid-chant when they saw Valora breathing steadily, her chest rising and falling with strength that shouldn't have been possible. One priest's staff clattered to the floor. The Elder Mother lives, one whispered, his voice filled with shock. Another priest's eyes widened as he noticed the bioluminescent patterns flowing across Valora's scales. Impossible. The crystal spine never stops. It never reverses. What is this? Behind them, Dravik stepped into the chamber, his massive form filling the doorway. His expression shifted from surprise to understanding to rage in the span of seconds. His eyes locked onto Kale, then to James, then to the medical equipment scattered across the floor. Heretic, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Kale with something like betrayal in his eyes. What have you done? You have defiled the sacred chamber. You have robbed your mother of her honored death. You have brought shame upon your bloodline that will echo for generations. James stood slowly, placing himself between Kale and the guard. His body ached, his hands were cramped, but he stood firm. The priest stared at Valora's glowing form, at the impossible sight of an elder mother not only alive but radiating light like a beacon. And in that moment, everything changed. The High Council convened within the hour. The great chamber was carved from a single piece of crystal that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Dozens of Drakthar filled the seats, priests, warriors, scholars and elders. The air hummed with tension and barely contained rage. Kale stood in chains before them, heavy iron links that clinked with every breath he took. His head was held high, but James could see the fear in his eyes. The young warrior knew what was coming. Death most likely. Public execution to restore honor to his family name. James stood beside him, unbound but surrounded by 6 guards. Their claws rested on their weapons, ready to strike if the human made any move. The message was clear. He might not be chained, but he wasn't free either. The high priest rose from his seat, his robes flowing around him like water. He was ancient, his scales dulled with age, but his eyes burned with fury. When he spoke, his voice filled the chamber with the weight of centuries. You have violated our most sacred law, he declared, pointing his ceremonial staff at Kale. You have defiled the death chamber. You have robbed an elder mother of her honored passage to the void. You have brought shame upon your bloodline that can never be washed away. He paused, letting the words sink in. The penalty is death for the son, exile for the human, and... No. The voice was weak but clear, cutting through the high priest's pronouncement like a blade. Every head in the chamber turned toward the entrance. Valora stood in the doorway, supported by 2 attendants who looked absolutely terrified to be there. Her albino scales now bore crystalline patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living light, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Blues and purples rippled across her body, beautiful and otherworldly. She looked like something from a dream or a nightmare depending on your perspective. She walked slowly but steadily into the council chamber, each step deliberate and strong. The attendants tried to help her, but she gently pushed them away. She would do this on her own. Mother, you should not, Kale started, his voice breaking with emotion. Silence. Valora's eyes fixed on the high priest, and there was steel in her gaze. For 3 days I lay in that chamber, screaming for death to claim me. My bones turned to glass inside my body. Every movement was agony. Every breath was torture. She moved closer to the council, and James noticed that she wasn't limping, wasn't showing any sign of pain. I accepted this as our way. As honor. I told myself that my suffering had meaning, that it was purifying my soul for the journey ahead. She paused, her voice growing stronger with each word. But in my darkest moment, when the priests had gone and the guards had changed shifts, when I thought no one could hear me, I whispered to my son. I begged him for something I could never ask for publicly. I begged him to make it stop. I told him I didn't want to die. The council chamber erupted in argument. Voices rose in anger and confusion. Some priests called for her removal, claiming the human's intervention had corrupted her mind, that she was no longer fit to speak for herself. Others remained silent, but James could see the uncertainty in their faces. "The human broke our laws," an elder council member shouted above the noise. "This cannot be ignored. This cannot be forgiven." "The human saw a patient in pain and refused to look away," Valora countered, her voice rising above the chaos. "He saw a living being suffering and did what his conscience demanded. My son showed courage that our people claim to value. He protected family above tradition, loved above law. And I." She looked down at her transformed scales, watching the light pulse through them. "I have been given something I thought impossible. Not just life but life without pain. Life with purpose still ahead of me. Life to see my son grow old, to teach the next generation, to contribute to our people." She turned to face the full council, meeting the eyes of each member. "Our people have watched our elders die in agony for 10,000 years because we called it sacred. We wrapped suffering in beautiful words like honor and tradition and sacred duty. But I ask you now, how many could have been saved? How many warriors, teachers, mothers, fathers lost because we valued an ancient ritual over the lives it claimed? How many brilliant minds, how many loving hearts, how many precious souls did we sacrifice to tradition?" The chamber fell silent. James could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. "I will not condemn my son," Valora said firmly, her voice ringing through the crystalline chamber. "I will not exile the human who gave me back my life. If you choose to do so, then you cast out me as well. Execute all three of us or let us live. But know that if you choose death, you will have to explain to the younger generation why you murdered those who fought for life." The high priest looked around the chamber, reading the faces of the council members. Some still burned with righteous anger, but others looked uncertain now, troubled. The younger council members especially seemed to be questioning what they'd always been taught. Slowly, reluctantly, the high priest lowered his staff. His hand trembled slightly. "The elder mother has spoken," he said, his voice heavy with conflicting emotions. "The human will be permitted to remain. The son will face no punishment." He paused. "But this matter is not closed. The council will convene again to discuss our traditions." As the council dispersed in uncomfortable silence, James felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He hadn't realized how tense he'd been until that moment, how prepared he'd been for the worst. Cale's chains were removed, and he immediately went to his mother, embracing her carefully. Tears of relief streamed down his scaled face, and Valora held him like she had when he was young, whispering words of comfort in their native language. Later, back in his medical bay, James was cleaning his instruments when Valora appeared at his door. She had to duck significantly to fit through the human-sized entrance, and the sight was almost comical. This massive, glowing dragon trying to squeeze into a space designed for someone a fraction of her size. "Why?" she asked simply, settling herself as comfortably as she could in the small space. "You knew the risk. You knew our laws. You could have died. Why save someone you barely knew?" James set down his tools, considering his answer carefully. "On Earth we have a saying, 'Not on my watch.' You were my patient. That meant something to me. Even though I am not human? Especially because you're not human." James smiled tiredly, the exhaustion of the past day finally catching up with him. "Back home, doctors take an oath before we're allowed to practice medicine. We promise to do no harm, to preserve life where we can, to treat our patients with dignity and respect. Nowhere in that oath does it say, 'Only for your own species.' It doesn't say, 'Only for those who look like you,' or 'Only for those who share your culture.' It just says to help those who need help." Valora studied the small human with newfound respect, her crystalline patterns glowing softly in the dim light of the medical bay. "My people thought we were teaching the galaxy about honor and tradition. Perhaps we needed to learn what honor truly means. Real honor isn't about following old rules. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The younger generation is questioning things now. Asking why we accept death as inevitable. Asking what else we've been wrong about. You started something human. Change is coming to my people whether the council wants it or not." As she left, James looked out at the stars beyond his window. Somewhere out there, billions of light years away, Earth continued spinning. Humanity continued pushing boundaries, refusing to accept the impossible, fighting against the darkness with nothing but stubborn determination and the belief that things could be better. He smiled, finally allowing himself to feel the satisfaction of what they'd accomplished. Just another day in the galaxy.